Okay, guys, so thank you for coming and checking this lovely video out of me talking about communism. It's going to be great. Um, so, essentially, communism, it's almost in a sense the opposite of capitalism, which we've talked about. Um, but I kind of want to go through like where it comes from and what the principles behind it are, because I feel like that's something that we see communism in practice, especially in North Korea, because they're lunatics in North Korea. But in terms of how it actually functions, it's intended to be a little better than it actually turned out. But as we're going to see, theory and practice are not the same thing. Um, so basically, I'll draw this over here. I'll pull up the notes in a second. But um, you know, communism works under the idea that you know you you have all of these uh, you know products that here in the United States, like we own, that are our things. So, for example, this sandwich here, who, this is my sandwich. I own it. So it's Mr. Zachary's. And these oranges over here, maybe they'll be, I don't know, they'll be James's oranges. Congratulations, James. So they're his. Obviously, they're not mine because I don't want the oranges. Uh, in the U.S., we obviously operate under this idea that those are mine, those are his. We understand that. In a communist type economy, it's not going to be like that, and instead, this is the state's sandwich, which they've given me, and these are James's oranges, which were given to him by the state. Well, they're not even James's oranges; these are the state's oranges, and James has them now. So the idea behind this is that everything is done what's known as, delete this. It's known as collectively. It's all collective ownership. So the state owns everything, uh, and you're just given kind of your share of the pie. And this is collective ownership, um, or your share of the orange or sandwich in this case. Um, so basically, what it comes down to, and this is kind of the actual written theory, is that communism it's a collective ideology, and it's um, the idea that there is no private property. Everything is owned by just the state. And if I go through this, I'm going to go through the sides much quicker than you would be able to write them. You're welcome to just pause the video and write down what you need to. All right, so all this kind of comes from Karl Marx's theory of, history and everything that's going on. And so to him, and this is kind of his critical idea, is he sees history as a struggle between social classes. So the idea is that it's all people competing to try and control property. And so what he kind of thinks is going to happen is that eventually you're going to get uh, this little bit of a problem where, you know, eventually the group of people that are down at the bottom are going to get tired of being down at the bottom. Um, so I don't know. Let's see if I can find a nice. Sure. This Baron here is a perfect example of somebody who is a have. He is um, he has property. And we talk about like feudalism and all that stuff. Uh, Barons have property. This is a baron. Um, they have property. They have land. There's a whole bunch of people that work on their land that don't have property, and they're going to get upset about that. Um, and so what you're going to see is that eventually, in Marx's idea, you're going to get this uh, collective being upset. Um, and so a bunch of people are going to be upset that they don't have land. And what you're going to end up with is um, essentially them overthrowing the government completely. Um, so this baron over here is going to get taken over by, I don't know, I'm looking for a bunch of people. Basically, a bunch of people are going to come in and take over the Baron. There we go. These two that are prank. But instead of just one or two of them, it's going to be like 10 or 12 of them, and they're going to be like, hey, there are 6 of us and only one of you, and we don't like that you have all the land and we don't, so we're going to rise up and take you over. Woohoo. Uh, and that's his kind of theory behind what's going to happen. And so, in his idea, is that, you know, the eventually this lower class is going to rise up, and it kind of makes sense if you think about like the "we are the 99% type of stuff that was happening. That there are a lot of people that don't like being in a position where they feel like they don't have anything and don't have the ability to get anything. And so to him, he thinks that the state, like the government itself, is you know, aiding to this problem because it's allowing the haves to keep what they have, and it's pushing the have-nots further into the category of have-not. Um, and to him, at the end of the day, this is kind of his big thing, is that the value of a commodity is not based on what you can use it for, but rather how much labor you've put into it. So in theory, everything should be equal because everything requires some level of labor to be put into it. Now, that basically goes directly against what we have in the United States, but that's kind of what he thinks it is. Um, and so this kind of all centers around this idea of, you know, communism, collectivization. It leads to a communist economy. Um, and so basically what he thinks is that, you know, there's going to be this overthrow, and he thinks it's going to be violent. He says there's going to be a violent overthrow, which he's right, because it's always a violent overthrow. And these people are then going to be able to take charge and run the country. Um, but what he recognizes is that initially people aren't going to be like, oh, great, we're all equal and friends, and let's all hold hands and, like, hang out with our puppies, and it's going to be great. He realizes that somebody's going to have to make decisions for the country. And so in his world, in practical, ness, it becomes the Communist Party who's responsible for doing this. And the problem with that is that the Communist Party doesn't always make the best decisions. In the Soviet Union in particular, and I'm going to jump ahead real quick, they have these things called 5-year plans, and they're designed to help like run the Soviet economy. Now, the problem with them is that some of the 5-year plans are really bad 5-year plans. So they spend 5 years government's time and the economy's time focusing on some goal that somebody set that either isn't something that they can actually reach or that's a stupid thing for them to be working on. And so what ends up happening is it screws over their economy, but we'll get there in a second. Um, so that kind of is the main role of the Communist Party. Again, there's collectivization, but it's also the idea that they plan everything. Those 5-year plans are done by the government. The individual person doesn't have a say in what happens, and that everything is state-owned. Again, there is no such thing as private property. So going back to the slide here, you can see that 5-year plans probably aren't going to work because you just have this collectivized idea, and it doesn't really work for their economy because nobody is motivated to actually do any work. Because the problem is that your salary and everything like that isn't linked to your performance. So if you do a really bad job at what you do, you still get paid. So nobody does a good job doing anything because they're going to get paid no matter what. And that kind of gets into a little bit of what human nature is like. If you are not motivated to try your hardest, chances are you're not going to try your hardest. And so this guy, Mikhail Gorbachev, who's kind of concurrent with Ronald Reagan, he's leading the country at the same time Ronald Reagan is leading ours. And he initiates this thing called perestroika. He also initiates glasnost, but perestroika is kind of economic reform. And what that is it basically, as you can see here, it creates a system in which, shockingly, this is a crazy thought that this would actually work, the harder you work, the more you get paid, and you can make profit, and you can gain personally from your hard work. And crazily enough, that actually starts working. And so that actually ends up leading to the downfall of the Soviet Union because people start realizing, like, communism isn't working, and they transition away from it. And so they've been moving since 1991, when the Soviet Union fell, into a free market economy. And they are undergoing a similar move to China. China still has a communist nation. Uh, uh, Mao Zedong took it over in 1949. They have their own version of central planning. Works out wonderful for us that they kind of rival Russia instead of helping Russia because that allows us to win the Cold War. Um, but over time, they've grown more and more and more free market because their country has 1 billion people. And if you have 1 billion people and you can't provide food to 1 billion people, they're going to get upset and get rid of the government that isn't providing them like food and safety and all of that stuff. We've talked about that plenty from the beginning of the year. I mean, this is like kind of that Hobbes idea, right? That with a Leviathan, if you have one person in charge, they got to make sure everybody else is happy or else they're going to get overthrown. And so China's realizing that the best way for their economy to work isn't through central planning, but through a free market, because it's going to allow them to produce goods that other people around the world want. Um, and so their economy today is moving more and more and more towards free market because they have to, otherwise the people in power are going to lose power. Um, North Korea we've talked about at length, but there's a whole bunch of communist countries in Asia, especially during the 60s and 70s, and that's why we end up fighting a war in Vietnam, uh, for better or for worse, because we're trying to contain communism, and that goes back to what you guys learned in U.S. history last year. Um, and then Cuba, uh, again, goes back to U.S. history last year, but Fidel Castro leads a revolution there. They become communists. They kick us out of the country, which sucks for us because it used to be our Caribbean Las Vegas, essentially, where people would go and gamble and get prostitutes and do terrible things and kind of take advantage of their country, which is probably why they kicked us out. But in doing so, they got this ridiculous government in place now where, you know, you have people that are constantly trying to literally flee their country. I mean, it's worth it to them to get in like a raft and try and go on their raft from Cuba to Florida because they're so desperate to get out of the country because it's so poor there. And so you kind of end up with a little bit of problems like that. I mean, it's really interesting actually. Like they have, if you go to Havana, they have all these stores that sell luxury items, um, but they're only there for tourists. The locals would literally need to save up everything they earned over the course of like 3 or 4 years in order to afford like one thing at any of these stores. I'm talking like, you know, Cartier watches and, you know, nice car companies and, you know, cigar stuff, things like that. So it really does lead to this kind of huge difference in terms of how their country operates, and it's not an ideal system. But we're going to talk at length in the lesson, um, in actual class, about kind of communism and whether or not it does or doesn't work, and we'll do activities with it. So thank you for watching. Again, if you need to see any of these slides, just feel free to go through and pause the video so that you can write down what you need to and then keep going. Um, thank you guys. Do be prepared. I'll probably have some sort of reading quiz associated with this, just to make sure you did it. So if you're watching this, you're going to be fine. If you're not, then tell your friends that aren't to watch this so that they don't fail the reading quiz. Um, all right, that's awesome. Thanks a lot, guys.